Moving on to another question raised by Ahmed Malikzab, and he says, why is it permitted in Islam? Why is it permitted in Islam to marry one's cousins when at the same time scientists say that it is unhealthy?
Dr. Saab, to begin, I think.
I think it's probably appropriate.
Well, our first foundation is that if Allah has permitted it, then certainly there must not be any harmful effects that needed for it to be negated. And even here in the UK, marriages between first cousins are permitted. So also here, there is nothing seen as being contraindicated to that. It's interesting that marriages between cousins, if you look at some of the statistics that is available on this subject, and there is a plethora of them, there's lots of them, we find many interesting facts about that. For instance, that marriages between cousins have a very low rate of miscarriages, and that obviously is a benefit. So there is something in the chemistry perhaps of people related that they miscarry less than the rest of the population. Also, if you look at the marriages that take place, it is estimated that 20% of all couples who are married around the world are first cousins. It's a very high percentage. And historically, over the generations, if you look at that statistic, is that 80%, it's a very high figure, 80% of all marriages historically have been between first cousins. So this is the sort of data that is available to show that this is a phenomenon that does take place widely, and in that respect it cannot be negated.
I suppose the following question from that is the assumption in the question that science suggests that the marriage between cousins is an unhealthy course to pursue. Does the science in fact support that assumption?
Well, not quite strongly support that. It negates that. In fact, in the most recent research in Boston, Massachusetts, professor has recently come forward with research and statistics on that aspect to say that the risks that are involved of marriages between cousins is no more than the risks for a woman that might be of a slightly older age, of a 40-year-old. And because you don't prohibit marriages to women who are or have children, women over 40, then this is an aspect that you should not obviously rule against marriages between cousins on that aspect. And so this is recent research which has shown that the risks are not far greater than for women of that age group. So even modern research is now showing that that is certainly not the case, that every time there is a cousin marriage, then the risks are that much greater for some hereditary problems that for the generations to come.
Exactly. Imam Saab, taking a step back from this all, obviously there's a practical question to ask as well, and just because something is permissible within Islam does not then make it a mandatory requirement for one to marry one's cousin, and there is wisdom in that as well.
Yes, certainly. I was actually going to say that the Holy Quran, we firmly believe, is a book of wisdom given by God Almighty, who is the fountainhead of wisdom. So we see that in the Holy Quran, Allah Almighty has prohibited certain relations for marriage, and certain relations have not been prohibited as such, cousin being one of the example. So the argument is that where Allah Almighty has prohibited something, there is definitely a danger in that, and where Allah Almighty has permitted, even if the danger may be there, it is not as great as people think. So that is why Allah Almighty has not permitted, because His wisdom is infinite. So we take the example of pork, for example. The pork Allah Almighty has prohibited for Muslims. Now some people argue that what's the harm in it? At a certain time they didn't know any harm was there. But Allah Almighty in His infinite wisdom from day one prohibited that one. And later on now people have discovered. So similarly, if the permission has been given, then there is a wisdom behind it, and as you have rightly pointed out, and I would agree to it, that it is a permission, it is not a command. It is not essential, it is not binding upon every Muslim that one must always and everywhere at all times must get married to the cousins. This is one of the options which has been left open. People can go for it or may not go for it. So Allah Almighty has permitted something, So it must be with a wisdom that he has made it permissible. But it's not a command, it's not an instruction that everybody must get married within that.
And Dr. Similarly, just following on the point where one must use one's wisdom and make a judgment in such matters, similarly, that doesn't only apply within the sphere of whether to consider marrying one's cousin or not, but even we see that, for example, particular illnesses are common to particular groups of ethnic groups as well, and within that sphere one has to be careful as well.
That's a more well documented and agreed research area, that there are certain hereditary factors that are linked more to ethnicity rather than blood relationships. Cystic fibrosis is a very common thing and it's in Caucasians it is very highly prevalent. 1 in 25 people of European descent have this gene that there may be a defect of cystic fibrosis. So Europeans obviously are at the head of that. Then we have the Ashkenazi Jews. These are people who have descended from Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, and in fact these are 80% of all Jews worldwide are related to Ashkenazi Jews. Most of the Jews in America are from the Ashkenazi Jews, and they have many hereditary factors in their genes, and there are 1 in 4 perhaps who are carriers of many ailments of this nature. Then we have blood diseases, for instance sickle cell anemia in people of African descent, or thalassemia from the Mediterranean, and these are all linked very closely to these ethnic groupings. So to say that you should not marry within these is also not the right answer, but what we have is that you can go for counseling or genetic therapy or testing to make sure that if there is a problem then you can try to avoid that problem. So we can use science to our benefit in that respect, but certainly ethnicity perhaps is a greater risk than being married to your cousins.
Jazakallah. And Jazakallah as well, Imam Sahab. Ahmed Sahab, I hope that's sufficient to answer your question.